to Blitzscaling, a startup. I am Julien Newman.
And I am Chris Ye.
And Chris, our topic for this week is a topic that you actually read my notes about for, I think, the first time in several months. So it's a notable fact.
Yes, although I will point out that I've now forgotten what the email said.
Well, all right. So I did bump it right before our meeting.
I have been out all day. I had to go down to up to San Francisco and speak at a conference, and then I got caught in traffic coming back and went to a meeting, a coffee meeting, and then came over here.
This is I think a big part of why our collaboration works so well is that I was a political staffer in a past life. So I'm like so used to kind of like managing busy people or people with busy schedules.
Yes, yeah, I think both are accurate statements. And people with busy schedules is perhaps the more precise one.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. Like I feel having worked in politics at a very young age, like I just like default to a political staffer mindset when dealing with people. And it's a really useful mindset because you're just like enabling others. Like it's in a way like the ultimate team player, right? Where it's
Mm.
like you completely subserviate or whatever. So like make
Right. So
yourself
you subordinate
subordinate.
your
Yeah.
concerns to the candidate or
Yeah.
the official because that's the bottom line. That's the irony of our system, right? A candidate has an entire organization underneath him or her helping elect and re-elect that person. But ultimately they once they are seated in the House or the Senate or whatever office they're in, they can make sole decisions, they could be influenced by others, but they are still the one person where the buck stops. So it does lend itself to that structure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a funny thing. Like I really do think it shaped my entire interaction with the world. Like the like I was thinking about this, like how like I think it made the way I see things like much more hierarchical.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's a testament to how your first job really matters.
Absolutely, because we learn these lessons and we often keep following them until they stop working. And in your case, you learned lessons that are still working today, so no reason to change them.
So our topic is should you move to Silicon Valley, pretty much.
Now I remember. Perfect. Thank you.
And it's interesting because right before jumping on this live stream, we were talking about some guy that I could make an introduction to, and we talk about how difficult it is to kind of keep track of everyone you know, and obviously being physically in a place is a good way to kind of like keep people top of mind. So people that are there are top of mind for users. Um, so that's obviously a benefit of being in Silicon Valley. But I think the way that I think about this question is as follows, which is for me and in large parts like it's because I've discussed this with you. But here's kind of like where my thinking is at now. Just like for me personally, right? So for my personal development, my kind of like if I think of my like my kind of like opportunities for mentorship, being in Silicon Valley is obviously the best, and it's worth it, right? Like whatever the cost would be, from a monetary perspective, is obviously worth it for me personally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm an entrepreneur and I'm starting a business, and there are a lot of other considerations that aren't just me. Now, part of it is that as a CEO of a business, you actually do create a lot, like personally, a lot of the value, and like your level of excellence really does matter. um but yeah, so that's kind of where kind of like my thinking is at. And I can go in a little bit deeper, but I'll let you kind of riff off that and like what's the kind of like wisdom here.
Yeah, so let's talk about Silicon Valley. And you're right, it really boils down to costs versus benefits or opportunities. And we'll start with some of the obvious ones. The cost of Silicon Valley is high. Living here costs a lot of money. Everything costs a lot of money. Talent costs a lot of money. And so, naturally, those of us who are constrained by money, which is nearly all of us, it makes a difference. And that's not just from a real estate perspective, not just from a cost of living perspective, it's also from a tax perspective. California is a high tax state. And if you make a lot of money in California, you might very well pay, you know, 12, 13% of that money to the state of California, which is the highest in the nation. I met a gentleman just last night, yes, just last night, who had moved to Las Vegas. And he found that it is far cheaper for him to live in Las Vegas and just fly back and forth to the Bay Area several times a week than it is to live in California from a tax perspective. Now, you end up having to live in Las Vegas. And so, you have to decide
Yeah.
whether or not you're willing to make that sacrifice. Personally, I would not, but, it made sense for him. So, huge costs to being in Silicon Valley. There are also some other more hidden costs. So, the more hidden costs is that it can be harder to stand out. So, for example, I have done a lot of work with the organization 500 Global. It's a fantastic organization, originally founded by my old friend Dave McClure, led to great heights by his ultimate successor, Christine Tsai. And it's an organization that does good work all around the world as an accelerator, incubator, investor, educational institution, and so on and so forth. And I do work for them on the education side, helping teach classes on venture capital and angel investing. Now, the thing about 500 Global is, and this is something the folks at 500 Global will admit as well, the reputation of 500 Global is much greater outside of Silicon Valley than it is in Silicon Valley. Outside of Silicon Valley, it is often the premier investor in the region, one of the few professional investor organizations, one of the ones that all the entrepreneurs aspire to get money from. Here in Silicon Valley, they have to slug it out with Sequoia, Greylock, Accel, Benchmark, and a whole host of other players who are so thoroughly well established and so legendary that it's hard for them to stand out. And the way they do that is by going early and backing underdogs, people who are really scrappy. But that is a cost, right? And the way that 500 Global gets around that is by existing both inside Silicon Valley and outside Silicon Valley. But that might be difficult for individual human beings to do. Those are all the costs of being in Silicon Valley. There are a few other ones. People would sometimes say, hey, it's a fast pace, a workaholic culture. People are too concerned with material success. I don't think you view that as a big downside, Julien, but some people do.
Yeah, in fact.
But then let's talk about.
Well, I was going to say, like, one of my concerns is I feel it's not sufficiently workaholic for my taste. So, but we can discuss that later.
It depends on the people you find within Silicon Valley, because there are certainly people who are massive workaholics. It's just that there is a generation of folks coming up who believe in work-life balance. I'm not going to tell them it doesn't make sense. I believe that it makes sense to rest as well as work. But that being said, you could take it too far. And I think you referred to people saying, well, I'm just not going to work on weekends. Famously, I think, Julien, you showed it to me. There was this video of a former Twitter employee talking about when he was still at Twitter. Hey, I'm so glad I'm at Twitter at my old company. I'm ashamed to admit this. I would work on weekends. Here at Twitter, we do things right. We don't ever work on weekends. And I'm like, wow, no wonder this company is going down the tubes.
Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic to your point of view, but I don't think it's all that common. I think that the work culture in Silicon Valley is still very strong relative to most places, although perhaps not as strong as famously China and some of the places where people work themselves to death. But in terms of the benefits of being in Silicon Valley, the obvious is all the network effects that exist in terms of bringing people together in close proximity. So the beauty of being in Silicon Valley is the ability to see people on a regular basis and to see people who are in the same industry who are going after the same things. If you're in Silicon Valley, you're not in the tech industry, it's probably not nearly so helpful to you. But in the tech industry, I'll just give you an example. I was going to a meeting yesterday at my neighborhood coffee shop, And while I was on there, I happened to see an entrepreneur that I've invested in who is also going to be an advisor to my fund. And I saw her because she works around the corner and we both go to the same coffee shop. And at other times, I saw my friend Phil, who also I've invested in his company, is a very influential person in the philanthropic world. He and his girlfriend were there getting some coffee because I went there to have another meeting. And the list goes on and on. Chance encounters, whether at my local coffee shop, which is actually out of the way, so it's kind of unusual, but more likely at places like Coupa Cafe or Verde or the Hannah House and the Blue Bottle, all these places. I'm constantly running into people. And that serendipity and that quick mixing really helps. And then, of course, going beyond serendipity, there's the fact that there are convenings all the time. I was just at a conference this week. I was at a conference earlier today giving a talk. I was at an AI meetup last night giving a talk. So all of these things are so much easier for me here. If I were in, say, southeastern Michigan, and I would wait and I'd have 1 week a year when we had Michigan Tech Week when I would speak. Here, it's Michigan Tech Week every single week. And so the opportunities are much greater, especially if you are someone for whom it comes naturally to go out and meet new people and develop relationships and the like. It is, of course, a matter of opportunity. You can choose not to take up the opportunity. You can choose to shut yourself in a room and work constantly, in which case you might as well be somewhere else. To really take advantage of the upside of the benefits, you have to be willing to go out there and develop these relationships. And where this plays out is in the ability to partner with other companies, in the ability to hire great people, and the ability to connect with and ultimately raise money from investors, the ability to connect with people at potential acquirers. All of these things accelerate the process of companies, which is why companies have tended to grow faster in Silicon Valley than anywhere else, and which has allowed a disproportionate number of the world's most valuable companies to be produced here. Now, I will now offer up one of my favorite homegrown sayings, which I call pond theory. So, pond theory is something that I came up with when one of my friends, who was a dear childhood friend, and I went to Stanford with, and then he was at the MIT Media Lab. What he told me is he said, sometimes I wonder if I'd be better off being a big fish in a small pond. If instead of having gone to Stanford and MIT, I went to one of these lower tier schools where instead of being one of many good people, I was the one overarching superstar. And in many ways, that's actually a better way to get a tenure track appointment as a professor because you really stand out and people are interested in you. I said, that's interesting, right? That's one theory, big fish, small pond. My personal theory is different. My personal theory is a fish grows to the size of the body of water in which it's swimming. So my own belief from my own life is, I went from pond to pond. I was at a particular elementary school, a particular high school, Stanford University, the world of business, Harvard Business School, Silicon Valley, and so on and so forth. And what I would argue is that the bigger the pond, the better I did, not just on an absolute scale, but also on a relative scale. Maybe that's because some of my particular talents are well suited towards larger ponds, especially in the field of public speaking and writing and so on and so forth. They have a much greater effect in larger ponds. But part of it is also, I think that growth is exciting. I think that learning is exciting. And I think that people who really love to learn, who are, as I like to say, an infinite learner, will tend to grow to fit the pond in which they swim.
So I accept all that. And like accepting all that, I probably agree with you that Silicon Valley is a place to be, right? But I have some concerns, and they're kind of like more mechanical, really into like building a business, right? So
Yeah.
let's say I'm in Silicon Valley and I hire 2 employees. Well,
Yes.
I have to pay those employees, so let's say like in real life, right? Like rent in Silicon Valley is $3K a month. Like it's really hard to pay less than that. And like especially if you want the employees to like live near the office, etc. Right? So
Right.
like even if you live with roommates, like it's not going to be that much cheaper. So, 3K a month, right, is, well, 35,000 dollars a year of, you know, before tax income. So,
Right.
after tax income, that's like, 40, 50K a year. And so the first, let's say the first $40,000 that you give to your employees, right, goes to pay rent.
Hmm.
And so you can't pay them $40,000 because then, I mean, they're paying rent and then they're not eating.
Right.
And that's very different than if they live, let's say, in Mexico City, or if they lived in Berlin, or if they lived, in Detroit, or if they lived
Right.
many other places. And there are a lot of kind of like downstream effects of that. So one is you're just spending a lot more money, so
Hmm.
it's harder to default alive, which in a context of capital constraints, which we're somewhat in now, matters, right? And another element of this is that, let's say if I hire somebody and I give them $100,000 a year, right, which is, like, maybe you wouldn't pay people that, but that's really what they need to get by, right? So I pay them $100,000 a year. Well, like, that's pretty much market rate for them. And like, why am I like, is there any room left to give them an equity ownership and aligned interest? So there's a kind of like cash flow and kind of like burn rate
Hmm.
issue, and there's a aligning interest, like leaving room to pay people equity, um element to align interests. I don't know how you would think of that.
Yeah, so let's talk about these mechanics. And I think your calculations and numbers are largely correct. And what this tells you is that any given amount of money that you raise won't go as far in Silicon Valley as it will go elsewhere. It's counteracted to some extent by the fact that it is easier to raise money in Silicon Valley than elsewhere, but it is still a challenge. But in thinking about it, we sort of have described the benefits of Silicon Valley. Well, the benefits of Silicon Valley, are they really as high for someone who's an individual contributor? We've been focusing on the entrepreneur use case. But if you're an individual contributor and you are spending most of your time working on code, maybe pinging your fellow employees or colleagues on Slack, it doesn't really matter whether you're paying $3,000 a month to live in a shack in the Bay Area or whether you're paying $1,500 a month to live in Oregon in the same time zone with a lot more room. Now, again, this is a question of the individual set of opportunities because the person in Bend, Oregon, whether they realize it or not, don't have as many opportunities. Because even though they could theoretically work for any company remotely, it's harder to develop those relationships that'll lead them to get those jobs. But if you're content with the organization, if you really are happy with where you are and you can manage to move somewhere else in a similar time zone with a lower cost and still work as an individual contributor, that could very well work. Now, flipping it around to the entrepreneur's perspective, the entrepreneur's perspective is this: when you are setting out to figure out whether or not your company works, whether or not your product works, it is a very bad idea to build it with paid employees in Silicon Valley because unless you're independently wealthy, you won't be able to afford to pay them. And even if you are able to raise money, you won't be able to raise enough to pay them for that long. There will be a ticking clock because you'll be paying them at least $100,000 a year, and it's going to consume the cash that you've raised. And so I tell people this is a very distinct phase. This is the startup phase when there's a lot of uncertainty and when you need to be very efficient with your cash. There's no particular reason why this phase is good in Silicon Valley. Now, what you do see are teams where one entrepreneur, for whatever reason, can afford to not work full time and really try to advance the company. They may enlist the help of friends who have a full time job but are willing to moonlight, or they're able to enlist people who have already exited and are trying to figure out what's next. So there are various ways to do that in Silicon Valley. without spending the money on salaries. But when you do that, you're probably going to give up a lot of equity along the way, because obviously there's no free lunch. So starting a company in Silicon Valley, even if you can find friends to work on it without having to pay them, is going to cost you in terms of equity. Now, for me, I wouldn't mind. I don't care if my friends get rich. In fact, I think it's fantastic. I think that outcomes tend to be binary. Either they're good or they're not. And whether you make 50 million or 100 million isn't going to make that big a difference in your life in the long run. The utility curve of money is nonlinear. So it suggests that if you're going to form a team in Silicon Valley, you have to form one of these teams where you don't have to pay them. But if you don't have ready access to the independently wealthy and or people who can afford to not work because of their spouse or what have you, then you might be better off starting your company in a lower cost area where you can actually stretch the money further, where you'll have more time to actually figure out whether it works or not. And then come to Silicon Valley when it's time to scale. And that ultimately is one of the points of blitzscaling. The point is not that Silicon Valley is the best place to start a company. It's a good place to start a company, but there are plenty of other places that are very good. And sometimes the cost benefit analysis leads you to start it elsewhere. But it is the best place to scale a company. But you should only start scaling your company after you have proven to your own satisfaction that the company has achieved product market fit, that this is a business that you want to run, and that there's room to grow and expand.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of like, hey, Silicon Valley is the best place to be, but there are concerns, and those concerns become less and less. Like most of the concerns are related to cost, and like the more you prove out your hypothesis, the more you have easy access to, like the more your investment thesis is backed by evidence, the more you have access to cheap money, and the money becomes less and less of a problem over time. So let's say like Uber famously at some point was able to raise like huge amounts of money really cheaply. They don't care. They didn't care. I mean, now it's different. But okay, that makes a lot of sense. There are, the other. I think the other element to this, and it's interesting. I talked to some people about it, and one of the things I heard was, it just depends on the business that you're building, and then is there actual expertise, let's say in Silicon Valley or for the business that you're building, and let's say we can take the area that I'm interested in right now, which is live stream e-commerce, right? So e-commerce isn't necessarily like a Silicon Valley thing, and actually maybe it would make more sense to be in Ottawa, Canada, which is actually, I lived there many, many years, and that's where Shopify is based, and maybe that's a better location. Maybe what I want to do is to be in Hangzhou, China, which is where Taobao Live, that's the kind of Chinese leader in this, is, so that I can kind of like live in the future. Maybe what I want to do is be in Los Angeles, so I'm, near Snap and Instagram, that are kind of like the leading consumer internet companies.
And surrounded by influencers, where the vast majority of influencers in this country are.
How would you think of that part of the equation, of the kind of like company or industry specific, ecosystems that may be more relevant Silicon Valley, or maybe relevant? Like one of the interesting things I'm getting from you is like relevant at different moments in your company's, journey.
Yes.
But yeah, how would you factor that in?
Well, I'm factoring in, just like you said, figuring out where the best place actually was, not assuming by default that Silicon Valley was the best place. But instead of having a rule, Silicon Valley is the best place, instead say, here are the costs and benefits of Silicon Valley, here are the costs and benefits of Ottawa, which actually makes sense at this stage of my company. And let's take the example of what you're working on. I think that one way you could approach it is for you to be here in Silicon Valley, because that would help you connect with collaborators and various other things. But I wouldn't build up your team here. Build up your team elsewhere. Right? I would take advantage of your Canadian roots to build up a team in Canada, perhaps. I think that LA is also a possibility, though it carries a lot. LA is not cheap either.
Yeah.
I do think that it would be smart to leverage the specific skills and assets and connections that you have.
So, maybe what and why, like what's the framework to think about that? So why is it that you would,
Yeah.
so let's say I have a team that teams in Silicon Valley, or I have a team that teams in LA, right? Like that's an easy one because they're close to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say for me, if I kind of, so let's imagine a world where we have a team that's based in Los Angeles, and then I have an apartment in Silicon Valley and an apartment in LA, and I kind of like travel between both. Like I'm half the time in LA, half the time in Silicon Valley, and um, so why is it? So you can see how that would be like an obvious thing that would work really well,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it superior to have the team in Los Angeles versus Silicon Valley? Like, what are the mechanics there?
The mechanics would be, first of all, cost. There would be some cost savings, though not a huge one. And the second would be greater familiarity with what you're actually working on. Developers and engineers are not totally fungible. If they actually understand more of celebrity culture, understand more about how streaming works, they're going to be better able to build a product. It's not just simply a case of hand them a PRD. Every engineer is making constant decisions. And if they have an intuitive grasp of the business, it's going to be more powerful. They also, by the way, because of all the entertainment activity that happens in Los Angeles, it's probably easier to find other people in the community who are knowledgeable about streaming and video and things like that. And so it's relatively easy for people in that ecosystem to adopt your product. Maybe it's easier to find the influencers. Maybe it's easier to find studios in which people can record some demos and things like that. And the geography just makes it easier for you to get to your ultimate goal. And that's what it ultimately is. It's like, here are the milestones we'd like to achieve. Here's how long and how much it will cost to achieve them in Los Angeles versus how long and how much it will cost us to achieve them in Silicon
Right.
Valley. And you should just be able to do an analysis. It won't be 100% correct, but it'll give you some idea of which might be the best approach.
So I think what you're saying is I'm trying to kind of extract the kind of explicit framework, which is like, as an entrepreneur, what matters most is your rate of personal growth and excellence. Right? Because like if the company outgrows you, well, you're fired pretty much, and it's a huge problem for the company.
Yeah.
For employees, that's less the case. Of course, you would like them to grow as quickly as possible, but that's not the only thing that matters. And probably the number one thing for employees is you want them to see what you see. So you want them to understand the customers, you want them to understand the
Yes.
vision, you want them to, well, that's mostly it. So you'd say, hey, if I have a software developer who works in Los Angeles, how likely is it they're going to understand streamers? Well, higher than if they're in Silicon Valley. And
Yes.
that might be more important, like a more important lever to use location to pull than or that might be the most important lever to
Right.
pull using location.
That's right. Because ultimately, I mean, that's the thing. It is a war for talent. And especially early on, it's really important to get the right people on board. If it's possible by choosing a different geography to get better people on board, people who are better suited because they have more experience in the specific things you want to do, then that's where you should go. And that's why Silicon Valley is often the right answer, but it's not always the right answer.
Okay, so here we're talking about, like, I like these examples because they create a lot of clarity. So you're saying, okay, one of the things that matters really for employees is empathy with customers. And you can generate that empathy through geographical proximity. So if you're doing a shipping company, like a real shipping company, you'd want to be in Chicago, for example, etc. Uh, what about, buying into your vision? So I'm going to use, like, so the example, let's say for me, right, is there is a company, there's an ecosystem where live stream e-commerce exists, and it's China, and you could enable your team to kind of like see that future really clearly by being there, right? I'll use another example that I think might be more actionable, which is Ola Cab. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're like Uber in
Yes,
India.
absolutely. Hmm.
So when I lived in India, well, spending more time in India, I that was like when Ola Cabs is coming up, and really what they did was like, hey, I see the future, and the future I see is Uber, but for India, right?
Hmm.
And for Ola Cab, right? Like I think what they would do is that they would hire Indians who had lived in the United States and who could see or like what Uber is like, and they kind of like had a shared vision due to having lived in the future, at least of their industry. Um, how much does that matter versus the empathy with the customers?
So I think that if it's just a question of gaining some of that experience, which is again partially empathy with the customers, like you said, people who had lived in the United States and had experience with Uber going to join Ola Cab is really about understanding the customer promise and the customer plight. But nevertheless, I think that you may be able to do this just by having people stay in a place for a couple of weeks or a month, right? It doesn't have to be the permanent place. Like,
Yeah,
for example, when you mention, oh, China is sort of the center of things and maybe we should think about going there, I wouldn't think about building a permanent team there because it's impossible to pull people away from the market leaders. They may say, well, what does this random Canadian guy know about this market and why is he going to compete here? But you could easily, well, I don't know how about easily, it depends on the immigration laws. You might be able to rent a house there and put your team up there for a month and give them a
right.
chance to really meet folks in the industry and get to know how people are working on things and ask all sorts of questions. And that 1 month might serve to provide them with an edge over people who haven't done that.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The final question, or the final kind of like concern that I had, um, is around work culture in Silicon Valley, and I
Yeah.
think like this is a hard one to wrap your head around because it's non-monolithic, right?
Hmm.
But so like, let's say for me as a founder, I am somewhat insulated from the Silicon Valley employee work culture because my peers are founders who tend to work harder, right? They're incentivized to do that. And investors who also tend to work harder, like just being in every room is a huge predictor of success for VCs. So, um, but let's say if you were to build a team in Silicon Valley, their peers are not founders. Their peers are employees.
Hmm.
And the reality is most of the employees in Silicon Valley are big tech employees at this point, right? They're Google employees, Twitter
Right.
employees. And so these employees that you'd have in your team would go to have drinks at the bar, or they'd meet people and have friends, and those friends more likely than not will work in some more established company, and they'll essentially have a 9 to 5 job, and they'll be paid a lot of money to do nothing, which is a I mean, I don't know. I think some people might consider that these people are workaholics. I consider that they're extremely lazy, but that's like my essentially I work like 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, right? And I think that's a normal thing. And that's what I would like my team to do. And that's not, at least anymore, the main work culture in Silicon Valley. So like, how how would you think about that? Like maybe my expectations are unrealistic. Like maybe that's your input, but I don't know.
So it's always a question of supply and demand, right? That's what all of economics is: it's supply and demand. And in an environment where jobs are plentiful, I think the things are as you described, where people will say, I could work twice as much, but I wouldn't make twice as much money. I'm making enough money now. I'm happy with where I am. And that you could call it laziness, or you could call it having a clear preference. However, we are in a period of time where there have been massive layoffs in big tech. People no longer feel quite so secure in their jobs. They still are pretty entitled, don't get me wrong, but perhaps less than they were over the last couple of years post pandemic. And so I think that maybe the laziness, as you describe it, is not as bad as it was. That being said, from time immemorial, the people who worked at startups and the people who worked at big tech or the people who worked at established companies had different work habits. And once upon a time, it was the hardworking early entrepreneurial employees at Cisco versus the big AT&T, Bell Labs kind of folks. And then Cisco becomes established, and it's the hardworking startup folks at Juniper versus the big fat and happy folks at Cisco. And then eventually it becomes another company and another company and another company. So the fact is that companies just have a natural life cycle, and you can't get people to work as hard later on because the outcomes aren't as tied to them. They understand rationally that at such a huge company, their actions only carry so much impact. And unless they're in the kind of organization where their managers can give them vast bonuses and reward them for their outperformance, they're better off just skating along. Whereas in a startup, if you skate along, your company's going to die. And if you outperform, you're going to make a pile of money. So I think that don't mistake big tech work culture for startup culture. That being said, I do think the younger generation is wary of being seen as working all the time. They do not see workaholism as a badge of pride, as perhaps once upon a time an older generation like yours or even an even older generation like mine did. So I think it is an issue, but I think that if you scratch the surface on any successful founder, you'll find they work a huge amount.
So I think there's a lot of to consider there, but I think the kind of like actionable framework for our topic is, look, company culture matters, but location isn't necessarily the lever you want to use to shape the company culture. So you can like it obviously influences it, but
Yeah,
like there are other things you can do, and the more powerful levers are, well, shaping your own company culture, and having your, like, for example, not being in a co-working space and having your own kind of like closed office,
that's right.
the standalone, and then another one that you touched on are kind of like incentives of the employees. um, so obviously location does impact it, but that would be tertiary element in deciding where to be located.
And by the way, again, if you're looking for places where people work that hard, there are a limited number of places where the default work culture is more workaholic than Silicon Valley.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Like I think New York is a little bit more intense, but it's it's only slightly
And concentrated more on the finance side, frankly.
yeah. Yeah, this is true. In startups, people are still like they're just like going to get like coffee with people all the time.
People live in New York for a reason, and it's
For
not
lifestyle.
necessarily to work like crazy. There's a lifestyle element involved. There's this idea: I'm young, I want to meet people, I want to have sex, and those things go against working.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, the place for people like China is the place where you have like the kind of like most intense work culture at this moment in time. Presumably places like India, now that they have, there are more opportunities there, stuff like that. But
Although, I
In a
mean, what
US,
does
in a Western
happen,
context, Silicon Valley is
yeah.
pretty good.
And by the way, just moving one of those places is not a guarantee either, because if people come to feel that their actions don't matter, they're going to stop working hard. People have to feel like their work matters and that their work contributes to the success or failure of what's going on. And anyone who does work just because someone else told them to do work is not going to work very hard.
So just to wrap this up, the the framework is is a little bit more complex than just like where should I be, and there's it's kind of like what is the right place to be at different moments in the journey of my company,
Yeah.
and then there's where should I as a founder be, and where should my team be, which are two different questions, and they may have the same answer, but they are different questions.
Yeah. And I
And
would say that the emerging default is not what it once was, which was put everyone in Silicon Valley. Once upon a time, investors would say, well, you have to locate everyone here. Like in 2000, everyone would say, hey, you want everyone here. And it was unusual to outsource or have people offshore or things like that. Nowadays, that's very common. Remote work, very common. And I would say the default is closer to, well, listen, I want you to be here because that's how you're going to stay on top of everything. But if you have your team elsewhere and it's lower cost and you have access to great talent and you're willing to do the travel back and forth, and I, an investor, do not have to, then yeah, go for it. And I think that that is a significant change in default over the past 20 years.
yeah, that's very interesting. As I know, like when I started my first business about 10 years ago, it was as you say, whereas like people are you just should be in Silicon Valley. If you're not, there's something weird. And it's interesting to hear from you what's kind of like normal, and and I think and then the what you want to do is it's kind of like as an entrepreneur you should be in Silicon Valley. You want to be somewhere like you want your team to be somewhere that you're comfortable traveling, like spending half your time in Silicon Valley, half your time there, and then where that is a matter of like the main factors of the team are, I mean, cost, and
Mm-hmm.
then empathy with customers. Like those are really the two most important things
Yeah.
of the team.
And I will throw out one thing that is overlooked, but I think really matters, which is time zone.
Right.
The fact is, when the time zones are radically different, like they are for us, it limits the times when we can actually collaborate. And that
Yeah.
slows things down. Now, you and I, fortunately, don't have to work together on a multiple hours a day basis. Otherwise, it would be nearly impossible.
Yeah.
But that is what happens in a startup environment. So it's like, okay, great. I have people in my hometown in India. I'm like, okay, that's wonderful. Are you able to function on 3 hours of sleep for 3 years in a row because you're getting up in the middle of the night to work with them?
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm like, hey, you know what? There's a lot of great options. It could be Canada. It could be elsewhere in the Pacific coast or even further inland, Las Vegas, a place like that. Same time zone. Again, I'm not saying Las Vegas is a great place, but I'm saying the time zones are decent. Even Latin America, a little bit closer, a little easier to deal with than, say, Europe, Middle East, or Asia. So I would just say don't forget the time zone factor.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. This was super helpful, and hopefully helpful to our audience as well. Everyone who's listening, please like this video. Subscribe if you're not subscribed, and join our Patreon, which is patreon.com/blitzscaling, so that you can get the questions. I send them to the Patreon before I send them to Chris. Um,
Awesome. And again, I would say in the end, I still think for founders, it's a great idea to come be in Silicon Valley. But I think that the default for the rest of your team is very different than it once was.
yeah, yeah, that is really interesting, and that sounds totally correct. So final thank you to Jeremy, Brendan, Shlok, who make everything happen. And Chris, speak to you next week.
I look forward to speaking with you soon. Although next week may not work, I might be on my way to Melbourne, Australia. We'll talk about that after the recording.
Oh, right.